In 1926, sixth grader Catherine Coleman is offered a full scholarship to the West Virginia Collegiate Institute. There, she shines amidst her older peers, and her brilliant mathematical mind eventually fast-tracks her life. Going forward to 1961, Catherine Goebel, now a widow and a mother of three, is with her friends, Mary Jackson and Dorothy Vaughan, on their way to work at NASA's Langley Research Center in Virginia when they face car troubles. A policeman who stops to check their identification expresses his doubt and surprise at not just one, but three African-American women working in the space program. Dorothy fixes their car, and the policeman's patriotism gets them an escort. After all, their work is of great service to the country and will help put their men in space before the Soviet Union. Following the news of the successful launch of a Russian satellite, officials at Langley are under pressure in a race against time. Al Harrison, the director of the Space Task Group, and Paul Stafford, its head engineer, discuss their eager wait for the latest IBM computer and also their need for a mathematician in the meantime. Over at the West Computing Group, Dorothy is designating work for her team of colored computers. These are talented women of color, known as computers who carry out calculations for various teams at NASA. To Mary's delight, Dorothy informs her that Carl Zielinski, the team leader responsible for the testing of the Mercury 7 prototype, has personally requested her and has offered her a permanent spot on his team. Just then, a supervisor, Vivian Mitchell, lets Dorothy know of the Space Task Group requiring a computer that can manage analytic geometry. After she suggests Catherine's name for the job, Dorothy asks about her own promotion to supervisor, as she was already carrying out those duties since their earlier supervisor left. Sadly, though, Vivian informs her that nobody at NASA is considering having a colored supervisor. On the first day of her new assignment, Mary impresses her team leader, Mr. Zielinski, with her prompt response offering a solution to control the heat shield. He encourages her to study to officially become an engineer instead of being reduced to just a computer. She tries telling him that she cannot hope for such impossible achievements being a Negro woman. He reminds her that he is himself a Polish Jew who lost his parents to the Nazis and is now working on spaceships at NASA, and goes on to say that if he could do what was unheard of, then she could accomplish the impossible too. Catherine joins the Space Task Group due to her mathematical abilities, and as the first person of color there, the pressure is on her when she reports for duty. While nobody expects Mr. Harrison to appreciate the computer he has been assigned, he is actually impressed with her responses and even tasks her with regularly confirming the work of others in the team, including Paul. While this causes a bit of unrest, Mr. Harrison reminds his team that solving the heat shield issue was their priority, and if it leads to them putting a man in space before the Soviets, then they shouldn't have problems in their calculations being checked. Paul hands over a bunch of heavily blacked-out files to Catherine, who is left to work with whatever little information she is cleared to know. A large part of Catherine's first day goes by in her long trek to and from the colored restroom, all the way back to her old building. Her absence is noticed by Mr. Harrison, and she is given another bunch of urgent files on her return. At the end of the long day, she is the only one left working apart from Mr. Harrison. When she submits her work, he tells her just how fast things change in their line of work, and her calculations will keep going to waste if she cannot match the pace. The next day at church, Mary's husband, Levi Jackson, tries to remind her of the reality that a female engineer of color was just impossible in their time. She tries not to be discouraged by his words, but also knows that he doesn't want to give her any false hopes. A little while later, she and Dorothy trick Catherine into meeting Colonel Jim Johnson, whose current responsibility in Hampton was to set up a National Guard unit. While he is initially shocked, Jim is ultimately quite taken by the pride Catherine has in the work she and her colleagues at the West Computing Group accomplish for the space program. Back at work, another heavily redacted file of the trajectory of the Redstone rocket is handed to Catherine for confirmation. Trying her best with the information she can guess, she carries out an intense calculation of her own, while Mr. Harrison oversees the arrival of their brand new IBM 7090. As Vivian tells Dorothy, this mainframe computer will be capable of replacing most of the work of the West Computing Group once it is up and running. While Catherine takes her break to get to her restroom, Paul and the others observe her work. He realizes the mistakes he made and sees that Catherine has somehow managed to arrive at an answer despite not having all the information. Eager to know Catherine's thinking behind finding the solution, Mr. Harrison summons her once she's back. She simply proves that she worked with what she knew, and math did the rest for her. Realizing her value, Mr. Harrison clears her to be given all the data she needs for further trajectory calculations without redaction. At lunch that day, While the ladies discuss how the new IBM could put them all out of jobs soon and what they should do to make themselves necessary, Vivian informs Mary that her application to the engineer training program cannot be accepted, since neither does she have the extra educational requirements, nor does NASA let females in the program. Later that day, Mary looks into having to take advanced extension courses at the local high school, only to realize that she may have to petition the court to let her study at an all-white school. On the other hand, Dorothy defies the line of colored and white at the public library to learn the language of computers, Fortran. The Space Task Group is troubled when news of Yuri Gagarin being the first man in space is released by the Soviet news. Mr. Harrison informs his team that they will now be expected to work even more to prove themselves. This brings about another failed Redstone rocket launch, newer variations, more work for Mr. Zielinski and Mary, and even more calculations and runs to the colored restroom for Catherine. While Mary finds herself submitting her petition in court, Dorothy further educates the ladies of the West Computing Group in Fortran to ensure their continued necessity at Langley. Studying the manual of IBM, she even fixes the issues it was facing in its installation. One day, frustrated at never finding Catherine at her desk when he needs her, Mr. Harrison angrily confronts her in front of everyone about her mysterious absence. Having just returned from the colored restroom in heavy rain, Catherine painfully confesses the whole truth of her having to make the trek all the way to the West Computing Group and back because there isn't a restroom she can use anywhere closer than that. Realizing all her troubles for the first time, Mr. Harrison declares the end of segregated restrooms at NASA. After Alan Shepard is successfully launched into space in his Freedom 7 spacecraft, he becomes the first American in space and is hailed as a national hero after his suborbital trajectory. Proud and victorious President Kennedy then announces that America has its eyes on the moon next. The Space Task Group gets to work with the next suborbital mission, with the Redstone for astronaut Gus Grissom before John Glenn's all-important orbital flight with the Atlas. Meanwhile, Catherine's relationship with Jim advances, and they begin to trust each other. On Mary's court date, she successfully presents her petition and is granted permission to attend night classes at an all-white school, making her the first Negro woman in Virginia to do so. Much to Paul's disappointment, Mr. Harrison lets Catherine work on John Glenn's Atlas orbit trajectory after her perfect calculations of Gus Grissom's upcoming mission. Paul then reminds Catherine that she cannot be credited for her work since computers do not author reports. Despite the calculations being correct for Grissom's mission and his success thereafter, technical issues with its heat shield resulted in the loss of the spacecraft, the Liberty Bell 7. This loss of taxpayer money leads to Mr. Harrison being questioned about his plans for John Glenn's safe return after his orbital mission. At the Space Task Group, Paul details how the math for Glenn's Atlas will be different from the earlier suborbital missions, because they do not know how to get the spacecraft out of orbit and safely back to Earth. Catherine requests to be included in further briefings so she can continuously monitor minor changes as they occur, but is denied. Paul simply informs her that she needs to work with what she has, or they would have to find someone else instead. Dorothy has better luck with getting the IBM fully set up, surprising even those who weren't able to install the computer. One day, Mr. Harrison overhears Paul telling Catherine that her latest calculations are of no use to them now because of changes that happened just 6 minutes back. Once again, she requests to be included in these briefings so she can work faster with the right information. But Paul replies that the protocol for women attending these meetings does not exist. Knowing the importance of the mission, Mr. Harrison understands that Catherine should indeed be present in the meetings and lets her in for their briefing with John Glenn and the Navy officials to discuss the landing zone of the mission. Impressing everyone in the room, Catherine successfully calculates the required coordinates for Glenn's recovery upon return. This leaves just the calculations to figure out the precise coordinates of pulling the spacecraft from orbit, which the IBM is capable of handling. But, as it requires programmers to give it the right data, Dorothy finds herself temporarily assigned to IBM. Having equipped the rest of the West Computing Group with necessary Fortran knowledge, she insists that they all be reassigned with her and ensures that they get to keep their jobs in the future. On the other hand, proud husband Levi Jackson sees his wife off to her first engineering class. At the Space Task Group, Catherine is inspired by Mr. Harrison to carry out a fresh calculation to figure out when they will be safe, pulling Friendship 7 out of orbit. And this time she remembers to keep her name out of the report. Getting home from work that night, Catherine is pleasantly surprised when Jim proposes to her in the presence of her family. In the run-up to the launch, Mr. Harrison informs Catherine that she would no longer be needed to work at the Space Task Group, since IBM is now doing all of its calculations. After her wedding, Katherine Johnson watches the broadcast of John Glenn's launch with the West Computing Group. Before the launch, Mr. Harrison notices a discrepancy in the landing coordinates calculated by IBM. John tells Mr. Harrison that he trusts Katherine and suggests getting her to check the numbers. Mr. Harrison invites Katherine to mission control at Langley and happily informs John that not only has she confirmed the coordinates, but she has even refined IBM's results to a few more decimal places. After Friendship 7's successful launch into orbit, everyone settles down for the next 10.5 hours for when the spacecraft will need to be pulled from orbit for recovery. Meanwhile, Vivian hands over Dorothy's new assignment as the permanent supervisor of the IBM computing lab and addresses Dorothy respectfully as Mrs. Vaughn for the first time. Technical issues with the heat shield on the Friendship 7 indicate that it might have to be pulled from orbit earlier than planned. This leaves John to make a manual re-entry after 3 orbits, facing the threat of burning up in contact with the Earth's atmosphere. However, to everyone's relief, John makes a successful re-entry and waits for recovery precisely at the coordinates calculated and confirmed by Katherine. This leads to Mr. Harrison appreciating her work and asking her to come back to his team. Thereafter, the 3 women continue to make history at NASA. After graduating, Mary becomes America's first African-American female aeronautical engineer at NASA. Dorothy's team at the IBM Computing Lab grows along with her importance as the first African-American supervisor at NASA. Katherine proudly includes her name alongside Paul's in her reports and continues to work with the Space Task Group for the Apollo 2 mission and further. She went on to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the country, when she turned 97 in 2015.